Over to you.
Good day, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for joining us in 39 Essex Chambers for this webinar, which we've called All Change in Government, All Change in Planning. The idea is to touch on some of the subjects that have come to the fore in the course of the last week and crystallised to some degree in the King's speech yesterday with the legislative programme for the forthcoming session of Parliament. With me, there is Dan Steadman-Jones, who's going to give the opening paper, the big picture, the big policy push, and cover the main themes of that. Then I'm going to touch on the topic of housing, followed by Flora. On my right is going to focus on the greenbelt aspects of the development and growth agenda. James Burton is then going to turn to deal with the renewables agenda, and Selina Colquhoun is going to round off with some discussion of the broader other infrastructure themes. And we hope at the end there may be some time for questions and answers, but we'll have to see how we go. There's a lot of ground to cover, and these are big issues. So we're going to get cracking straight away with Dan Steadman-Jones and the broader policy agenda.
And Dan, I'm going to share the screen and bring your slides up.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks, James. Yes, so thank you, everyone, and thanks for attending. I have titled this the government's growth strategy because we've all been through the recent or experienced the recent election campaign, which was well, arguably it was a bit of an ordeal for everyone, and it was characterized by a lack of detail in many respects and a lack of substance in a lot of the core issues. But what was clear from the debate and from the Labour Party manifesto and from Labour's statements since, that planning and infrastructure and energy are all at the very heart of the new government's agenda. So I thought I'd begin by just providing a little bit of context, again, based on the fact that we didn't get a huge amount of detail from the election campaign itself. Clearly, Labour have put growth right at the heart of their agenda. It's obviously not growth in the sense of the kind of Truss, Kwarteng or Thatcherite Tory tax cuts and deregulation type approach. It's instead draws its inspiration from the American Bidenomics agenda, which has been articulated since Biden became president in 2020, and lots of massive public investment and private investment bills have been introduced through Congress and are proceeding apace. So I said it's not a typical sort of deregulation kind of agenda, except, of course, interestingly, in the context of planning, because as we know, much of the rhetoric around the planning agenda from Labour has been about streamlining it and about making it quicker and speeding it up. And so in a sense, it is a form of deregulation, at least that's being rhetorically proposed. And obviously, we'll have to see what some of the contours of that look like in what some of the detail from some of the subsequent speakers will show. But so that, as we know, the context is basically a position where there isn't very much money. And as a result, Labour are putting a lot of investment, as it were, no pun intended, but investment in planning as a ticket to growth. So James, if you can. So what do we know so far, and how is this form of growth to proceed? Well, the first big policy, which was announced in the course of the manifesto and the election, but was then formally announced last week, is the creation of a national wealth fund. This is to be capitalised with 7.3 billion of public money. And the idea, again, building on the context I've already described, the idea is to crowd in private sector investment at a rate of 3 times that figure. So one hopes in the end to achieve a figure of more like 20 or 20 plus billion in new money, investment, both public and private investment. And they've placed infrastructure right at the heart of what that money is meant to invest in. And in particular, therefore, in energy planning and development of infrastructure projects. Thanks, James. The second big ticket item, as it were, is the idea of the Great British Energy, which is meant to be a publicly owned energy company. And again, it's been established to co-invest in energy projects, co-invest in the sense of government investment, but hoping to attract private investment, again, to the tune of the 3-to-1 ratio that I've already said in relation to the National Wealth Fund. But critically, again, for planning also, the key plan with regard to Great British Energy is to deploy local energy production to benefit communities across the country. Now, there's again, with a lot of these new policies, there isn't a huge amount of detail, but what's envisaged is thousands of local projects, and primarily they will be a combination of onshore wind, solar, and hydropower. So what other early signals have we had? Well, we've got a new Secretary of State, the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, and we've heard already that there won't be any more levelling up, at least in the title or her job title. So that was an early signal. And then we, of course, as many of you will have probably seen, Rachel Reeves, the new Chancellor, gave a very important speech on the 8th of July, so just over a week ago, placing planning reform again at the centre of the government's agenda. And she said planning reform has become a byword for political timidity in the face of vested interests and the graveyard of economic ambition. So bold rhetoric again. Labour have targeted 1.5 million homes in this Parliament, which actually in itself is not a new target, because we've had that target in the past. But of course, we haven't achieved anything close to that for very many years. We had an announcement about an NPPF reform. We had an announcement that there'd be the reintroduction of mandatory housing targets and a task force on stalled large housing sites. We've had an end of the moratorium on onshore wind and a consultation, and there is an announcement that there will be a consultation on whether onshore wind should also be given NSIP status for appropriately sized projects. There has also been an announcement that there will be an energy infrastructure strategy that will build on the spatial plan for energy infrastructure. And then we've had a formalisation of Labour's plans for building on the grey belt, which of course has been discussed since the autumn, since Starmer's speech in the autumn at the Labour Party conference. Thanks, James. We've had also an announcement on resourcing, so there'll be 300 more planning officers, and we've had, I think this is an important point, that there will be greater ministerial intervention to achieve the goals that have been outlined, and the Deputy Prime Minister, when she intervenes in the economic planning system, the benefit of development will be a central consideration, and she will not hesitate to review an application where the potential gain for the regional and national economies warrant it. And Rachel Reeves went on to say the Deputy Prime Minister will also write to local mayors and the Office for Investment to ensure that any investment opportunity with important planning considerations that comes across their desk, so hers and the Chancellor's desk, is brought to their attention, and also, well, to both their attention. And then finally, we also had the announcement that, again, part of the manifesto and the Labour Party policy in the election, that there will be a rewriting of national policy statements under the Planning Act 2008 regime. James, thank you. So then yesterday we had the King's speech, and I know that Tom in particular will come on to talk about this in a bit more detail. I mean, there wasn't a huge amount of detail in the King's speech, although there were some notes attached to it. But in regards to planning, the King's speech said that my ministers will get Britain building, including through planning reform, as they seek to accelerate the delivery of high quality infrastructure and housing. So a planning and infrastructure bill. And again, relating to the growth strategy, they will also pursue sustainable growth by encouraging investment in industry skills and new technologies. In relation to infrastructure, the King's speech said that a bill would be introduced to set up Great British Energy, which will be a publicly owned clean power company headquartered in Scotland, and which will help accelerate investment in renewable energy such as offshore wind. And again, legislation will be brought forward to help the country achieve energy independence and unlock investment in energy infrastructure. So before passing on to the topic areas in a bit more detail, just by way of conclusion, there is a clear drive here, obviously, for planning to be at the heart of the government's agenda, and it's been backed up so far with early action. I mean, I think what we've seen in a sense is a sort of roadrunner level of activity, but however, the steps that have been announced are still relatively modest. I mean, in a sense, they're tortoise-like steps, although, of course, we know that the tortoise won the race in the end. So we'll have to see how it pans out. But I mean, an obvious example, well, two obvious examples. One is resourcing. I mean, 300 planning officers is great, but as we all know, resources are a clear problem in relation to achieving any kind of real reform and driving it through the system. The second challenge, if you like, I think is an important theme that we've always had in planning, and certainly we've had it in the last government, right back to the coalition government and before, which is the problem or the clash between the centre and local. We know that Labour has both an intense, as it were, desire to prioritise housing, energy and infrastructure, and to do that through central government to some degree. But equally, there's an equally powerful, certainly according to some parts of the Labour coalition, agenda for devolution. And of course, devolution may not entirely mesh with that central direction that Labour seeks to achieve. So we have some very familiar challenges, actually, and we are still very light on detail. But I think we can say that Labour have made an energetic first series of signals and steps, and I suppose therefore we should all be optimistic to some degree that at least they are serious about trying to institute some serious reform and to achieve the development and the infrastructure that the country needs. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much indeed, Dan. We'll move on to my topic now, which is housing, and I've titled my slides "Housing a Growth Agenda?" And we go straight into the first title, what is proposed in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. That was one of the elements of the legislative programme mentioned yesterday in the King's speech. I won't attempt the accent, but as Dan reminded us, the King said, "My ministers will get Britain building, including through planning reform, as they seek to accelerate the delivery of high-quality infrastructure and housing." And as Dan alluded to, Dan had also issued some background briefing notes to accompany the King's speech, and some of those are relevant to housing. They note that the current planning regime acts as a major brake on economic growth. The bill, they say, will play a key role in addressing this constraint. The planning system must be an enabler of growth, enabling democratic engagement with how, not if, homes and infrastructure are built. And then the bill is to make improvements to the planning system at a local level, modernising planning committees and increasing local planning authorities' capacity to deliver an improved service. Those 2 points are then repeated as if they ran out of ways to deliver that objective. But we understand the second of them is in part a reference to the 300 additional planning officers that Dan alluded to a moment or two ago. Of course, that's probably not one per local planning authority if one looks at all of the country, but it will make some small impact, I've no doubt. Modernising planning committees, on the other hand is an interesting concept, and it would be very interesting indeed to see what that means in practical terms. And then the last element in relation to housing, further reform to compulsory purchase compensation rules to ensure compensation paid to landowners is fair but not excessive, where important social and physical infrastructure and affordable housing are being delivered. This reform, it said, will help unlock more sites for development, enabling more effective land assembly, and in doing so, speed up house building and delivering more affordable housing, supporting the public interest. That's also in the notes. So those are some important themes for the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. In relation to policy, there's been a variety of new policy themes trailed. And of course, we'll wait to see how these are consolidated over the course of the next weeks and months. The target of 1.5 million homes to be built over the next 5 years is the headline figure. Effectively, as Dan said, reinstating the 300,000 homes per annum target adopted by the last administration until its status was effectively downgraded to advisory. No government, of course, has achieved this since the mid-1970s. Then there's a return to mandatory housing targets for local planning authorities established by a standard methodology and irrespective of the character of the area. This would reverse the amendments to the NPPF made by Michael Gove in 2023, which in reality have had little opportunity to filter through to most adopted plans yet in any event. So there are other short-term supply-side opportunities which I imagine will be considered. And at the top of the list, of course, is whether the 4-year housing land supply exceptions could be reversed so that everyone's back in the 5-year channel. There are also other adjustments that could be made both to 5-year housing land supply and to housing delivery test metrics and triggers to engage the presumption in favour of the Grant of Planning Commission in more cases. Those are essentially numerical levers that are available to the Secretary of State to play with, as we've seen in the past, that are able to turn the tap on or off to a greater or lesser degree, depending on the maths. And there is an expectation that these and other variants will be considered when the framework is reviewed. I've entitled the next few slides Discussion, and it's my personal take, and no more than that, on what we know so far. I would say it's really too early to pronounce one way or the other whether this amounts to a properly considered strategy for growth. As a country, we have not built 300,000 homes per annum for 50 years. 200,000 has been about the limit under both Labour and Conservative administrations, certainly since the public sector stepped back from house building in the 70s. The larger numbers that were achieved in the post-war years, the 50s, the 60s and 70s, included a substantial element of public sector housing, some of which, in the haste to build, has not regrettably stood the test of time. Moreover, the conditions for change, in my view, are not especially propitious. The hoped-for boost in development will largely need to be developed by and delivered by the private sector. But the economics of development, of course, have changed, and the costs of construction, workforce, materials, and of course of development finance have increased dramatically, and the financial burdens which a development has to bear remain high, very high. Many planning permissions, and the LGA say well over 1 million units, lie unimplemented for a variety of reasons, the most common of which is likely to be viability. So in my view, there needs to be a proper understanding of development economics, and there may well need to be public intervention to unlock developments which are highly desirable, have planning permission, part of an allocated proposal in the plan, but are simply not deliverable in the present and immediately foreseeable economic climate. My next point is that I very much hope that wholesale reform of the planning system is to be avoided. Regrettably, certainly my 35 years practicing at the planning bar, it has become apparent that very few politicians really understand the planning system, and the planning and the political intervention in the planning system has rarely been a success and takes many years once changes have been introduced to bed down, often delaying rather than promoting growth, which of course is what the government says it wants to do, which we all understand and mostly, I'm sure, support. But a good example is the current rhetoric about greenbelt, one of the concepts most cherished by the fathers of modern planning. Very few commentators seem to realise that the greenbelt, the designated greenbelt, is only about 13% of the United Kingdom, has a very specific function to perform in a small and select number of cities. It's already reviewed periodically and releases are made after careful consideration. And of course, those who wish to see it released and developed may have allowed its condition to deteriorate, but its visual quality has never been a quintessential part of its purpose right from its inception. The notion that it is, as some have said, largely or in large part petrol stations and car parks is surprising. Flora will say a little more in more detail about the greenbelt in a moment or two. New housing, it is to be hoped, will be concentrated where it is most sustainable and where access to services and facilities is easiest. And our cities and towns need to be a part of the focus, especially in the face of increasing retail decline and the need to repurpose large parts of many centres. I note in this context that new and more flexible CPO powers could be an important tool in achieving land assembly for such projects where there are most frequently a large variety of different interests, freehold and leasehold, in play, and it's bringing those sites together, often very well located for sustainable development, but just too fragmented in terms of ownership to enable them to come forward quickly. But new and more flexible CPO powers might well assist in delivering growth in those highly sustainable locations. But if reforms are carefully targeted and driven by those who really understand development and development economics, and I do emphasise that point, then there is cause for hope. But as you would expect at this stage, we will have to wait for the detail over the course of the next weeks and months. Thank you. I'm going to hand over now to Flora, who's going to say a little bit more about the Greenbelt policy prospectus.
Flora, just before you begin, could I just remind our audience that we do have a Q&A running. We've had a few questions already, but please post your questions and we will do our best to deal with as many as we can in what will hopefully be around 10 minutes at the end.
Thank you. And yes, as foreshadowed, I will be talking about Labour's plans for the Greenbelt. And probably as with many of these topics, there's not been a great amount of detail as to how exactly Labour's proposed changes to the Greenbelt will be brought about, but I will try and summarise what we do know from the government. So moving to the first slide, the Labour Party manifesto expressly mentioned reform to the Greenbelt as one of the government's priorities. Firstly, the manifesto set out that Labour is committed to preserving the Greenbelt and that it doesn't intend to change its purpose or its general extent, but also recognising that in the government's view, a more strategic approach to Greenbelt land is needed, and that there needs to be some release of what is referred to as lower quality grey belt land. As Daniel noted, it's come as no surprise that Labour intends to reform planning policies surrounding the Greenbelt, particularly in relation to housing decisions. Reform to the Greenbelt has been touted as a key mechanism by which the government will deliver its boost into housing delivery. And the Labour Party had initially mentioned the idea of changing the Greenbelt and indeed creating a grey belt some time ago, and has long made its intention claim to tackle quote unquote NIMBYism. So it was no surprise when the Labour Party manifesto included this commitment to open up development within the greenbelt. So moving on to the next slide, what detail do we actually have? Well, the manifesto referred to Labour's proposed 5 golden rules for development in the greenbelt. The government obviously hasn't published any proposed changes to greenbelt policies yet, but in April of this year, some more detail about these so-called golden rules was given by the government. Moving on to the next slide, the first commitment or the first golden rule is brownfield first. So interestingly then, as a starting point, the first of the golden rules relating to the greenbelt is in fact that development shouldn't take place on the greenbelt and should actually be directed away from the greenbelt and towards brownfield sites within cities. But the first principle is also said to include a prioritisation within the greenbelt of brownfield sites. In terms of how this brownfield first approach will be secured, it's not clear whether this will be done by way of some sort of sequential testing. So anyone wishing to develop in the greenbelt will first have to demonstrate they've considered alternative brownfield sites. We simply don't have the detail yet. It should be noted, though, that the policies included in the current version of the NPPF do already include some prioritisation for brownfield sites within the greenbelt. I'm sure those listening will be aware that the NPPF already defines brownfield land in the same way as previously developed land, and previously developed land is one of the types of land within paragraph 154 of the NPPF, which is deemed to be not inappropriate if certain conditions are met. For brownfield sites, it's that they cannot have a greater impact on the openness of the greenbelt, or that they would not substantially harm openness where they make a contribution to a recognised affordable housing need. So there is already within the NPPF a provision for brownfield sites to be redeveloped. Presumably, if this is one of the golden rules that's going to be at the centre of reforms to greenbelt policy, that exception to inappropriateness will need to be brought more to the forefront, and perhaps the qualifications included in the development of brownfield land within the greenbelt will need to be narrowed or streamlined. It will also be interesting to see in this regard whether Labour seeks to amend and simplify the definition of previously developed land in the NPPF, because currently it is fairly lengthy and convoluted, and that currently forms the basis for the definition of brownfield land. Moving on to the next golden rule. The next golden rule is grey belt second, and the picture there is one of the disused filling stations that was targeted by Labour. That's an image from a campaign video complaining about the government having refused development on a disused filling station, I think in Tottenham. But this idea of grey belt has been described as prioritising development in grey and ugly areas of the green belt. Obviously, as a definition, that's fairly unclear, and doesn't really give a lot of indication as to how this concept of the grey belt will actually be defined. The fact that it's been separated out from brownfield land perhaps suggests that the grey belt isn't just going to include brownfield sites, but also potentially ugly greenfield sites or low quality greenfield sites. But without really a more detailed definition, there's not much more I can say on that. I suppose it's slightly unclear from what has been said about the grey belt to date, how it really relates to the purposes of the green belt, as Tom indicated. The fact that a site might be subjectively ugly doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't serve a very important purpose in terms of the green belt, because the purposes of the green belt, the key purposes, are preventing urban sprawl, preventing towns from merging. And there may, for example, be a site that an inspector or a planning decision maker considers to be subjectively very unattractive, but performs a very important role in ensuring that urban sprawl and the merging of towns doesn't take place. So there seems to be a slight tension there between the way in which the government wants to reform and push forward this idea of the grey belt and what the grey belt actually means and how it relates to the purposes of the green belt. Because things like ugliness, beauty, visual quality are dealt with really in other parts of the NPPF. Moving on to the next slide, the third priority or golden rule is that any greenbelt land that is built on must target 50% affordable housing, so very high targets for affordable housing within the greenbelt. This would clearly be a positive step in terms of delivering affordable housing, and it is certainly the case that within the greenbelt, the delivery of affordable housing has generally been relatively low. An analysis that was undertaken by CPRE in August 2023 showed that 13 recently approved and developed greenbelt policies delivered only 5% social housing and overall consistently less affordable housing than was called for by local planning policy. But I suppose the counter to that is that one would assume that the fact that delivery of affordable housing in the greenbelt has been so low has probably been due to either issues with housing delivery or issues with viability of developments that are seeking to deliver higher proportions of affordable housing. So setting a target of 50% affordable housing within the greenbelt sounds fantastic, but it won't really work out in terms of the delivery of housing if developers simply can't afford to deliver that much affordable housing. Moving on to the next slide, the fourth golden rule is need to boost public services and infrastructure. It seems relatively uncontroversial that if you're going to see the expansion of urban areas, that needs to also be met by associated expansion in infrastructure needed to service new housing. And the fifth golden rule is the protection of what has been referred to as genuine green spaces. So whenever there is building on the green belt, that needs to be met by the delivery of new green spaces and the creation of new spaces accessible to local people, and a need to ensure high environmental standards. But again, as with the grey belt, environmental standards and public open spaces are obviously positive things, but they're not necessarily strictly relevant to the question whether a development is going to actually serve the purposes of the green belt or preserve the openness of the green belt. So again, there seems to be a bit of a tension there. So in terms of the impact of these proposals, they're likely to come through changes to the NPPF, which we have been told will be happening relatively soon. But they haven't been brought forward in the same manner as the changes to the onshore wind policies. So it's likely that we're going to go through the same process of consulting and changes being brought forward, presumably sometime in the autumn. In terms of what impact any changes to greenbelt policy will have, I mean, it partly depends, I suppose, on what the detail actually says. There would probably be two ways to unlock development in the greenbelt. First, in terms of changes to strategic planning and plan making, making it easier when going through the local plan process for local authorities to release greenbelt land. But obviously that's a process that's very slow and is unlikely to see any great delivery of housing before the end of this Parliament. Or alternatively, you could see policies making it easier for individual decision makers to consent land on the greenbelt, which I assume will probably play a greater part. But it will definitely be interesting to see whether we're really looking at a ripping up of the rules and restarting, which could possibly deliver more change, or whether we're just going to be looking at subtle amendments to the existing greenbelt framework, which may deliver less housing than the government are perhaps anticipating.
Thank you very much indeed, Flora. And we now turn to James for his piece on renewables.
Thank you very much, Tom. Yes, that was fascinating, Flora. I mean, if there's one thing I feel I've had drummed into me about Greenbelt, it is that it is a spatial, not a landscape or visual designation. And I'm struggling with how we get to Greybelt without actually ripping up some of those rules, those fundamental rules. But to renewables, And this is, in many respects, a topic perhaps less fraught with riddles than what might be forthcoming in the greenbelt, because we have actually had not just promise, but also a little bit of early delivery here. So we can have a bit clearer picture regarding the direction of travel. I'm going to cover a number of topics. I want to start big picture first, then move through a few different topics regarding onshore wind. I want to talk about what has actually already happened, then the proposed move or shift of onshore wind into the MSIP regime. I want to discuss where we are and where we might be in terms of community benefit and onshore wind, about which there's been quite a lot said already, but we're short on real detail. We've had a raft of big solar decisions come through from the Secretary of State for Energy at Miliband, and I want to talk about what those tell us, and then I'll say something about other renewables. So first of all, to the big picture. Now, Labour made absolutely crystal clear in its manifesto its commitment to renewables, the drive to net zero, and clean energy. And of course, what it said, I'll remind you what it said in its manifesto: clean power by 2030. And there was some quite specific promise behind that clean power by 2030 headline. That included doubling onshore wind, tripling solar power, and quadrupling offshore wind by 2030. And we also had mentioned investment in carbon capture and storage, hydrogen and marine energy, and what was described somewhat pejoratively as an end to a, quote, decade of dithering over decisions regarding nuclear power. Labour said it would ensure the long-term security of the nuclear sector. So a lot of rather big, bold promise in the manifesto. And we then had some immediate backup to that on the 8th of July with the policy paper that was billed as removing the, quote, de facto ban on onshore wind. And from the King's speech yesterday and the very helpful briefing notes that the Prime Minister's office published alongside, we had some more of the same, although not really much more detail. I mean, what we were told: streamlining the delivery process for critical infrastructure, including accelerating upgrades to the national grid and boosting renewable energy, which will benefit local communities, unlock delivery of our 2030 clean power mission and set net zero obligations, and so on, and simplify the consenting process for major infrastructure projects to enable relevant and improved NPPFs to come forward. That was all things we'd already heard, we already knew about that. So let's dive immediately into some of the detail that we do have. And of course, the starting point has to be the 8th of July policy paper concerning onshore wind, and what it said it did immediately in terms of changes to the NPPF. Now, you will recall that onshore wind has been given a very particular status, unwanted, of course, by anyone in the onshore wind industry, in both national planning policy and legislation. This policy paper purports to, I'll say something about this, but purports to deal only with the more egregious in the eyes of the industry bits of national policy, and those are footnotes 57 and 58 to the NPPF, and footnotes to paragraph 163. That's the part of the NPPF that deals with renewable and low carbon energy. And what those footnotes do, what they say, or what they said anyway, is that so far as onshore wind is concerned, unless you have something that's local community supported in a local development order or a neighbourhood development order, a community right to build order, to be acceptable, your site has to either essentially be allocated, the precise wording is an area identified as suitable in the development plan or an SPD, and you have to have demonstrated that planning impacts identified by the affected local community have been appropriately addressed and that you've got community support. An incredibly high hurdle that in reality is insurmountable for all but the most modest schemes. We are talking one turbine schemes, and as you know, there's been next to no onshore wind development for about a decade. Now, the practical effect of the change is that it almost puts onshore wind on the same footing as other renewable low carbon energy development. But I say almost because we still have, and I mentioned legislation, we still have the rather curious, in terms of how it sits amongst its peers, Article 3 of the Development Management Procedural that requires for onshore wind, and only for onshore wind, pre-application consultation. Anyway, that's what the policy paper says it does. Question: are there any vulnerabilities in it saying it is doing that? Now, of course, the legal mind immediately asks itself, here we have a policy paper that's appeared with no prior consultation. And in actual fact, in terms of the Labour manifesto, that didn't say we will do these things from day one. It criticised the, quote, de facto ban on onshore wind, but it didn't actually say we're going to do this. Is there, therefore, any realistic basis for a challenge on consultation-related grounds? Well, first of all, the NPPF, of course, is a non-statutory thing, other than in the broadest sense that the government's powers to make national planning policy derive from the fact of a comprehensive statutory planning regime. And it follows there are no statutory requirements to consult before you amend national policy. Secondly, the previous government did not, in fact, always consult on changes to national policy, and they, for example, made policy by way of written ministerial statements. And in one case concerning shale gas that some of you might remember, the reason that the challenge to that change succeeded was on fact-specific grounds and not because the government could not simply change the NPPF without consulting. And of course, this is a new government, and we are told that the changes will be in the updated NPPF, which we're all watching for. So, to me anyway, a breach of legitimate procedural expectation looks pretty unlikely, and I need to check when we're out in the seminar whether there's been a parliamentary update today, which we were promised. There was also, at least not that I've been able to find it, no qualities impact assessment, but again, looks to me like a breach of the public sector equality duty is not an obvious candidate for a ground of challenge. Moving to NSIP. Now, this is one of the other things that the HDGI policy paper tells us to expect, that the government will consult on bringing large onshore proposals into the nationally significant infrastructure project regime, followed by a revised national policy statement. Now, if onshore wind is going to come into the Planning Act 2008 NSIP regime, what threshold? The default might be thought to be 50 megawatts, but times have changed. The technology has changed since onshore wind was once the cause for so many planning battles. Now, single turbines are potentially up to 200 meters to blade tip, potentially with a 4 megawatt capacity per turbine. You don't need many turbines, a dozen turbines, say, to hit a 50 megawatt threshold. There are pros and cons for developers and objectors. If everything but genuinely quite modest onshore wind is brought into the NPPF regime. It's an expensive regime, no question. It can bring with it speed, although that hasn't necessarily been the case. At the moment, certainly with the current Secretary of State, developers would have to be thinking that they stand a rather better chance of ultimately getting consent at the end of the process. But it's not a cut and dried decision, in my view, in terms of, is this a benefit for the onshore wind industry? Is it a disbenefit? Is it a benefit or a disbenefit for objectors necessary? What about community benefit? This is the final point that Cape Giant policy paper, to my mind, covers and says something interesting about. It says that in addition to communities being empowered to participate in decisions on local infrastructure, communities should rightly benefit from hosting local renewable energy infrastructure. And that is why we will shortly publish an update to the Community Benefits Protocol for onshore wind in England. Now, the issues, just to remind us all, the issues are that one cannot buy, sell planning permission. There are very strict rules, often referred to as the Newbury rules, which are reflected in the NPPF about what conditions can be imposed, and there are strict statutory rules regarding planning obligations. This has been a hurdle. Developers' ability to overcome local planning objections by effectively the carrot of community benefit has been a hurdle that developers have consistently failed to surmount. And Right and Forest indeed is the case that still stands in the way. In my view, I'm interested to hear what others think. In my view, the only clean, clear answer is legislation to cut this Gordian knot. But if you're going to do it for onshore wind, can you legitimately stop there? Is a real question. The recent solar decisions, what do they tell us? Well, in a nutshell, certainly the Secretary of State for Energy is very enthusiastic about renewables, low carbon. We knew that. That enthusiasm is very real. The Sunnica decision, which is a massive scheme on the covering Cambridgeshire and Suffolk, is the one that really stands out. It really stands out because, yes, firstly, the Secretary of State overturns the examining authority's recommendation, but secondly, because he disagrees with the examining authority on so many topics, including hard-edged topics, in particular, heritage, where there is, through National Policy Statement EM1, there is a requirement that great weight be given to harm to heritage, including harm to designated heritage asset through harm to its setting. And ultimately, the decision, whilst recognising that great weight to be given, gives harm to a registered parking garden through harm to its setting, moderate negative weight in the overall planning balance, which is interesting. The other two decisions, they make similar weightings, but in slightly different wording, which is perhaps less notable to me. Might over-enthusiastic decision-making be opening, perhaps, the government up to a greater risk of challenge? Question mark. Other renewables, what do we know at the moment? Well, actually, very, very little indeed. To my knowledge, we haven't had the opportunity, as it were, for the Secretary of State, any of the Secretary of States, to make a decision on a DCO or a call-in regarding, for instance, energy from waste renewable, and of course, the Fenland District Council challenge to the Medworth Wisbeach DCO was refused permission literally the day before we all went to the polls, so we don't know what might have happened there, if anything. So watch the space on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, James. That takes us to Selina, who's going to address, by way of overview, other infrastructure elements in the growth agenda.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you so much, James, for taking us through all the renewable stuff. I'm tail end with non-renewables, and I will try and get through this slightly lickety-split, so we actually have some time for answers to various of the questions that have been asked. But thank you very much, whoever is doing the slide pressing. I think that's James. So what do we know about other infrastructure from both the Chancellor's speech and later I'll look at the King's speech? Well, I'm afraid, as with others, there's some detail, but not very much. So the big issues and the big takeaways from what we know so far, and it is of course very early days, is that the new administration wants to show that it is able to take decisions quicker, which I think is the point of the Sunneker and the other two, Maynard and Gate decisions, of getting them out as quickly as possible. The only one, in fact, that seemed to be subject to some delay was Sunneker, but Sunneker is so massive. The fact that there was some consideration being given to it in various consultations that were carried out following the examiner's report was not that much of a surprise. Nevertheless, and notwithstanding, and it is a controversial permission, the point I think that the administration was making was we are going to try and speed up the important infrastructure decision making, not just renewables, of course, but elsewhere. What Rachel Reeves told us generally is there needs to be reform to the planning system, but thus far, there's nothing really groundbreaking that we're being told about. The complaint is there that it's an antiquated system. You know, we've always heard this. Every single administration has blamed planning for the system for it, whereas actually more often than not, it's because these are complicated decisions that need time and important consideration given to them. But clearly the complaint there is there's too much red tape. They're on a mission to kickstart economic growth. So we do know that, and we've known this for some time from the manifesto, that planning is at the heart of that economic growth drive. And she spoke about urgent steps necessary to build the infrastructure. Now that, as Tom quite rightly highlighted, the cost of actually building the infrastructure, even once you've got through your quicker decision-making process, is also a really, really big issue here that isn't part of the planning debate. But that is going to have to be addressed if any of this is going to come about. There's obviously reference to getting onshore wind farms back on, and possibly NSIPs, and James has dealt with that. She said that priority should be given to energy projects in the system to ensure that they make that's decision maker, existing energy applications that she says should be swiftly addressed. Next slide, please. She also mentioned the spatial plan for energy, which Dan mentioned. We'll see what comes with that. It's at the moment, in its current draft, it's a great document full of wonderful ideas, but in terms of it actually having any real impetus, this is just my own view, I don't think that it gives us much. But if there is more to come through that, then so be it. I thought of particular interest, changes to the system and the way that ministers use the powers for direct intervention. Now that, I think, was a really big issue. The notion that that ministers who will be told about big decisions in local areas should have greater powers in effect of call-in is quite a threat, and it is seen to be a means of trying to discourage the NIMBYs, clearly. But those powers of actually saying to local authorities, if you're going to refuse a really big scheme, then we will take it from you, and that is a difficult one. If it's simply, once it goes to appeal, at that point, the Secretary of State would inform that they're going to be the final decision maker. That is an existing power, but that is not really what's being implied. So that is one I think we need to watch out for it. We're told that the DPM won't hesitate to review an application where the potential gain for regional and national economies is warranted. Now, that again implies that if something is refused, DPM might step in again and try and reinvigorate it. It's a very, very interesting concept. Anyway, let's move on to the King's Speech. Sorry, at the end of that was also the reference to new NPPFs, and I'm just going to come to that later. So I'll quickly look at the King's Speech. Sorry, thank you very much, James. So the King's Speech, obviously, reference to this planning and infrastructure bill, delivering high quality infrastructure. We've also been told about the Better Buses bill and in effect returning the Great British Railway system to being a public company and publicly run. I mentioned those because obviously there will be things that flow from that, but that is more about the administration of it and how it's going to effectively run. And also, in terms of aviation, no reference to airports as infrastructure, but particular reference to sustainable aviation fuel and how that might be produced. So those are all interesting points to consider in the context of any further infrastructure. Sorry, next slide, please. In terms of the planning and infrastructure bill, reference to streamlining, that is not a new idea, but it's to be aimed at critical infrastructure. Well, how do you identify that? One of the questions that was raised by someone who's watching was whether emergency services might be treated as infrastructure. There's no reference to that, but critical infrastructure at the moment seems to be directed at the things that are going to actually make the economy start moving. So would be things like energy and roads and airports, although roads and airports get no mention at all in the King's Speech. Of critical importance, though, I think across any of the energy sector, but in particular renewables, is trying to do something about the national grid, which is just gridlocking everything, and also directing renewables and other energy schemes to places where you simply you're forced to accept the connection or otherwise. The limits that are upon producing good infrastructure schemes from the limits upon national grid is a really critical issue. So we'll see what they do about that. I haven't heard any good ideas about how you can do it, but it's clearly necessary. Simplifying the consenting process for major infrastructure, that is a very interesting point, but I don't know what they mean by that. In terms of NSIPs, it couldn't be more simple in terms of you've got a 6-month examination period within which things have got to get done. The delays and the complexity comes from either side of that process, and in particular when it's turned over to the minister who has to make the final decision, which obviously happened with Seneca. It was with the Secretary of State for some considerable time, and that it would be interesting if some time limit was put on a minister, but that would be highly unusual. In terms of major infrastructure projects that are dealt with through local authorities, that may be an area where, in effect, ministers may want to drop in. So that might tie up with that notion of, in effect, calling in big decisions. And in particular, we come back to the NPS and that there should be a 5-year review system for designation. Although there was always meant to be a full review system in place. Let's look at NPS. Thank you very much. Next slide. So of the current NPSs we've got, energy have last been updated and newly designated as of January of this year. We can see that nuclear itself still is yet to be updated, which is in fact the critical one, but that means that still only gives nuclear facilities or list nuclear facilities up until 2025. So it is very, very important that that NPS gets updated. In terms of transport, the one for ports is still 2012. I mean, it's so old that it's creaking. National networks, at least that again is up to date, but the airport NPS, which of course was very controversial, that hasn't been updated since 2018. And there, as I say, everybody's been very quiet about airports at the moment from this new administration. Next one, please. Next slide, please. Water and wastewater, there's been a bit of move on. We had the water resources infrastructure one designated back at the end of 2023. And wastewater really is in need of updating. That's 2012 as well as hazardous waste. Wastewater is critical in my view. So that may well be something hopefully that gets addressed. And geological deposit disposal infrastructure, that's relatively in good. So there are some that clearly have been or are updated and are in good form, but there are many others that do need attention from this government. So those are the ones to be looking out for. Next slide, very quickly. Thank you. So just to mention the other aspects of the King's Speech that of interest, we've got the high-speed rail Crewe to Manchester bill. It's been carried over from the last administration. There's no reversing of the decision to cancel the second phase of HS2. They want to repurpose Crewe to Manchester in order to provide powers to construction operate rail projects. So there's a positive move there, but depending upon whether you how strongly you feel about that cancellation of the second phase. It does include, as they say, other important infrastructure issues for Manchester and the surrounding area, in particular the new stations at Piccadilly and the airport. But the main thing is to give support to the north of England to try and get that productivity gap going. So they've tied that in with that bill, but as I say, that's carried over. And then lastly, sorry, next slide. Or is that, that's it. That's it. So drawing all that together, I come back to, they want to speed it up, but my goodness, how are they going to get it all built? So question times now. Thank you.
Thank you, Selina. We have almost inevitably run up to and indeed just over the wire because there's so much to cover, again, as everyone anticipated. We have had a series of questions that have come in on a wide variety of topics. And my instinct is that given the timing, we ought to try and respond to those where possible in writing. But there are a couple of themes. I'm going to be volunteering my colleagues for that exercise. But I think there are a couple of themes that perhaps could be picked up on. And James, you want to take lead on any of those? Well, we'll overrun perhaps till 1:10, and then we will definitely call it a day.
Yeah, max. So yeah, thematic questions, or at least in the sense questions that have cropped up in different guises more than once. A couple of questions about what difference, if any, the environmental principles policy statement is going to make. And of course, that's in the context of ministers having to have regard to it when formulating policy. Well, all I can say about that is that the duty, it is a duty to have regard, but it is, as we will know from many other formulations of similar duties across legislation, therefore a procedural duty, as opposed to a duty to achieve any particular substantive result. And we had the very recent decision, of course, Mr. Justice Leven, that also in fact got the government out of jail on the fact that it hadn't quite managed to have regard at the time it was actually producing the final policy, but had managed to do so retrospectively and at draft stage. So I certainly I'm not expecting any substantive result by reason of that duty that wouldn't have come forward anyway, in fact. But it will at least focus ministerial minds, no doubt. The other one, we've had a couple of questions about compulsory purchase, and one question in particular was asking us whether or not this would apply to which type of authorities might get new or more flexible CPO powers. Now, just to remind everyone, we don't know very much about what's being proposed regarding compulsory purchase, but the language that keeps cropping up is something that's fairer, a fairer reflection of value, which does very much speak to some kind of move towards removing hope value, but perhaps simply having existing use value. I did actually write a little bit of a diary entry about that yesterday. I'm just wondering, is that actually going to end up driving development in terms of land assembly to greenfield if we end up with a somewhat surprising existing use value system? Anyway, I thought I'd pick those two up because they were repeated.
Yeah. And in relation to which authorities, I'm sure that local planning authorities and housing authorities will remain the focus, but of course we have, assuming there's considered to be a continuing role for Homes England, which I hope will be the case, then they may also see further powers assigned to them. They do already have some compulsory purchase powers, but they may be extended or expanded if the government sees that as appropriate. Yeah. I think
Tom, shall I just quickly? We had one question on GB Energy, and I just wanted to say, because I think it highlights about the government itself. The question was whether GB Energy itself will be a developer. And I mean, I think at this stage, GB Energy is interesting partly because we don't know. It's going to be a key battleground, I think, for Labour's approach, and there may well be very different instincts within Labour itself about what GB Energy should do, and how much the public nature of it, or how far the public nature of it should extend. So I think it's an open question at the moment as to whether it will actually be a developer, or indeed whether it will just facilitate the investment necessary for the projects to happen. So I just thought I'd flag that one.
Thank you very much indeed, Dan. A number of parties have asked whether it will be possible to obtain the slides that accompany this webinar, and I think the likelihood is that that will be the case. So if you make contact with Chambers through the usual channels, then assuming that all of my fellow contributors are happy with that, then we'll be very happy indeed to send those on to you. As we're approaching 10 past, I think I will thank everyone for participating. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. We hope you found that useful and a helpful reflection on the current state of play. And we look forward to seeing you again in the future when the next raft of developments comes over the horizon and more commentary is required. Thank you very much.
Bye.
You're